Veritas, which facilitates access to finance for businesses to innovate, to adopt clean technology. Based on your experience, I would love to hear your perspective on how MSMEs and the clean tech startups can get access to second stage capital. We often hear a lot of startups, they are able to get seed capital based on their idea or even on the premise that we would like to test this great idea, and the lenders, the investors, the venture capital funds, most often in the seed capital space, they are willing to put that money because if they find a technology to be promising, they're willing to fund that. But the challenge lies in taking this to the next stage, the second stage capital, the late stage capital, which becomes a fairly challenging thing for the clean tech companies, even for the MSMEs for that matter. They are able to do a small demonstration, but for them to do a large scale deployment, they find it very challenging to raise that money. So based on your perspective, can you throw some light on what do you think can really unlock the capital that's out there? And a lot of capital is coming in India, and a lot of private sector capital is also starting to come in. How can we make sure that the MSMEs are able to get money for the second stage or the late stage deployment?
Thanks, Suresh. So I think I'll just pick off from where Chintan left off, right? Which is the fact that mainstream banks don't understand MSMEs, and they especially don't understand startups, right? Despite, government having startup schemes and whatnot. But if you look at when MSMEs look at energy, clean tech adoption, or any form of climate adoption, right? Our first suggestion to them is that before you start looking for a loan or a capital for the adoption, ask the climate tech startup that you're working with, the solar company or the EV company, if they can spend instead, right? And offer it as a service to you. Can they offer you a PPA, or can they offer you cooling as a service or boiler as a service? Now, which basically means that now MSME does not have to raise capital, which is great because MSME is finding it difficult to raise capital, but now the startup needs capital. And there comes the question of where does the startups get capital from? And as you rightly said, in India, our research shows that while there's a lot of capital coming into climate, it's coming at the two ends. It's coming either at the early stage of a startup where people are getting money from accelerators, seed funds to set up a business, to do a pilot for the technology, or it's coming from large PEs, large DFIs, when companies need hundreds of millions of dollars. And there is what we call a missing middle, which is that, let's say I am an energy efficient startup and I have done my first project with a seed capital. How do I then now get capital to deploy it at scale? How do I go from, let's say the first 5 lakhs of revenue to several crores of revenue, at which point I become attractive to larger PE funds and they can put a lot of money, right? I think apart from the most obvious answer, try and raise another equity round, which only works if you have, shown traction, and equity investors in the future rounds want to see more de-risking, more traction, more customers. We have found many other innovative options that have come in the market. I would maybe mention a couple of them. One is venture debt. Venture debt is typically AIFs or NBFCs who are able to give loans to early stage startups because they have already raised equity capital from someone credible, and the lenders believe that now that a Sequoia has put in money, they have hopes of raising more money in the future, and they can give them a little bit of a loan to increase their runway, in the sense to keep growing their business until they're ready for the next round. So that's one option. That only fits startups who have raised capital or a seed round already. What about startups who may not have raised capital from a big fund, but they have visibility of orders, right? So let's say we meet many companies who are who have done a pilot, who have proven their technology, and they now have a order to deploy their technology, and they have to sell, let's say, energy efficiency equipment worth 1 crore. But now for them to sell this energy efficiency equipment worth 1 crore, they need working capital of 30, 40, 50 lakhs, right? there, our suggestion usually is for them to go to what we typically think of as supply chain finance providers. These are either NBFCs or platforms who are able to do what we think of as order-based financing, which essentially means that if you have a confirmed order, you're able to then, raise money to fulfill that order by by the raw material and working capital for that order, and then return the money once you have your customer pays you. This usually works best if your customer is someone credible, because the way lenders look at it is that you as a startup is not very credible today, right? So they have no way to figure out if, yes, they know that they know that you have technically validated your business, but they have no way to figure out if you will repay the loan, right? So the reason it works is that because you're selling to an Indian oil, and Indian oil is willing to say, yes, we will pay the lender directly once this is delivered to us. So then the lender actually is only taking a risk of you delivering the product, and that's it, and nothing more than that. We've seen those work quite well for early stage companies. Now, this capital obviously comes at prices which are higher than what a bank would offer. But the truth of the markets today is that banks are not offering credit to these startups, which means that for them, it's a function of, can I raise enough capital to get to the next stage, which de-risks me enough for me to raise the next round of equity and then raise larger debt capital. So that's where these supply chain finance platforms, that we call them, or order-based financing, comes into play.
Interesting. These are fairly very interesting comments that you made, and I think some aspects I do think that should be implemented by financial institutions, and I do think that supply chain finance, where you're able to get the buyers, it makes a lot of value proposition. Are there any examples from your own work where you have seen the work that you have done with Unitas, where you've enabled organizations or clean tech startups to get the early stage capital, and then also probably the middle stage or the scale up capital? Are there any examples?
Since that's all we do, I think I can think of a few, but I would take, I think, two examples, right? So I think one, which was probably an example of what I was talking just now about supply chain. I think one, startups and MSMEs need to realize that there's no point going to banks, right? Banks will not do this because they don't have the policies and the kind of paperwork they need. They will not be able to approve this loan even if they want to, right? Which means that you have to find specific lenders, and there are about 20 of them today. One of them who only does this, right? Who's only able to offer early stage lending. Now, one example that I can think of is a company that we work with quite closely. They are into smart metering, and they had, through multiple pilots, to raising a seed capital from a couple of family offices, done small projects, and they received a really large order from Adani, essentially, for several crores. And at that point of time, we took them to one of these supply chain platforms who was able to structure capital so that they were able to buy enough raw material to build these smart meters, put their tech on, implement the project, and then scale from there. They have subsequently gone on to raise a Series B and are now executing much larger projects. So that's one example. I'll give another example, potentially unrelated, of another early stage company that we directly funded through our operating lease model. So this is a company that essentially is building on-farm solutions to increase income for farmers, right? So today in India, a lot of food gets wasted at the farm level because it never reaches the mandi, it gets spoiled. So this company has an intervention that lets them basically sell dehydrators, solar dehydrators, to women farmers, and these women farmers can then dry this produce and sell it back to the company, rather than those tomatoes or potatoes or onions going to waste. So what we were able to structure was a lease financing program where, because this woman farmer cannot afford that 80,000 or 1 lakh rupee in upfront capital, we were able to offer that as a leased asset to this micro entrepreneur. And then the monthly income that she derived from this asset was enough to cover the lease payments. And in 3 years' time, she could just own the dehydrator. It has a 10-year life. So she could just then keep working with it. So that's another intervention that has worked really well beyond solar. So solar PPAs are very common now, but we are now seeing leases happening in electric vehicles where EV companies offer them as services to a big basket or an Amazon. In solar dehydration, solar cooling, all of these products, we are able to offer lease solutions.